We're going to be focusing now on the autonomic nervous system. So if you remember, you have autonomic and somatic. Somatic was voluntary and controls your skeletal muscle. That's kind of what we did with all of Unit 2, but now we're going to focus more on autonomic, because pretty much from now on and moving into the future, it's all about your internal organs, and that is your autonomic nervous system. So this is how you control your cardiovascular system, your digestive system, your glands, and things like that. And what we'll learn next is your autonomic nervous system is actually split into 2 more branches. So the abbreviation for autonomic nervous system is ANS. So if you ever see ANS, that just means the autonomic nervous system. So we're talking about involuntary responses to control your internal organs. It's part of your peripheral nervous system, and it also controls, when I say muscle, I mean smooth muscle, organs, and blood vessels. We are often unaware that this is occurring because it functions involuntarily, and there's a lot of reflexes. So we're going to be talking about the efferent pathway. Remember, your efferent pathway is coming from the central nervous system to your effector organ. So we're not talking about sensory nerves at all. We're just talking about from the brain or spinal cord to the effector organ. So you'll have a preganglion neuron. So basically your ganglion neuron is where they meet. So your preganglion neuron, this is your first neuron. This is one that resides in the brain or spinal cord. So this will come from the brain and the spinal cord. So it's starting off in the central nervous system. Your ganglion is outside of that, and it's where the synapse occurs. So for instance, if it's ACH, that's where ACH will be transferred in the synapse. It'll attach to the receptors, making it more permeable, sodium to sodium ion. Sodium will come in, changing it to positive, and action potential will go through. So you have your preganglion, it'll meet at the ganglion, and that's where your neurotransmitter, norepinephrine, we'll talk about in a little bit as well. And then you have your post-ganglion axon. This is the neuron that will extend all the way from your ganglion to the effector, contracting it, stimulating it, slowing it down, exciting it, or inhibiting, depending on what it has to do. So the neurotransmitters that we'll be talking about, either acetylcholine, this is during parasympathetic. We'll talk more about that in a minute, but your parasympathetic is when you're calm. Your pupils are shrunk, you're slow, deep breaths, your heart slowing, and you're digesting food. Rest and digest. So acetylcholine, is when you're calm. That's when acetylcholine will be released, and that's actually what's happening now as you're listening here. Unless I'm making you nervous, you should be in your parasympathetic system. During sympathetic, so let's say you're exercising or a test is coming, and some of us get really stressed out, or you're trying to get out of a wave of moving vehicle to survive. You're in fight or flight. You're going to use acetylcholine and norepinephrine. So now your pupils would expand. You have fast and shallow breaths. Your heart pumps faster and your gut stops. So you no longer are digesting food, because all that energy is going towards increasing your heart rate due to norepinephrine. Depending on the type of receptors present on the target organ, the response will either be excitatory or inhibit. You will learn later about each organ and what happens during these responses. So for parasympathetic, you have acetylcholine. For sympathetic, you have acetylcholine and norepinephrine. So just seeing what it looks like here. So this is just efferent. So that means this is coming from the central nervous system, either the spinal cord or the brain. So this would be your preganglion, right? Imagine this is inside of your brain or spinal cord, and it's coming in the ganglion. So this is where the neurotransmitter would be transferred into the synapse. And then this is your postganglionic fiber or neuron, and it would go all the way to your effector organ. If it was your heart, it would either excite or inhibit, depending on if you're in rest and digest or in fight or flight. Okay, so we're going to start in parasympathetic. So parasympathetic, just if you kind of remember rest and digest, it'll help you to remember this a lot better. When you are resting, that's when you're digesting. So that's your body's time to take the food that you've consumed and turn it into energy. Okay, so that means most of your energy is going towards that, and it's kind of shutting down all the other parts. So rest and digest. It keeps body energy as low as possible so the body can digest and eliminate feces and urine. The blood pressure and heart rate are at normal low levels. Your gastrointestinal tract is actively digesting food, rest and digest, and this is the parasympathetic. In your eyes, your pupils are constricted and the lenses are accommodated for close vision to improve the clarity of close-up imaging. They think like what some of evolutionists think, evolutionary people think, is that this occurs so that foragers would go and like look very closely at plants in order to identify it and see if you could eat it or not. Okay, so parasympathetic. We'll talk a little bit in a minute about where it's coming from, but if you see here, you'll see most of it's actually coming from the brain. You have your pupils are constricted. Why do you think you'll be stimulating saliva? Because your rest and digest. Everything is going towards digestion. Your bronchi constricts. That means it's like there because you don't need a lot of oxygen. Your heartbeat slows. Peristalsis, just so you know, that means that it's like all the smooth muscle is contracting and squeezing through your intestines. Bile is being released, so it's breaking down the food. Your bladder, so that's when you urinate. So the more relaxed you are, the more that you will actually digest food. Okay, so your preganglionic neuron, remember your preganglionic neuron comes from the central nervous system. So where in the brain and spinal cord is it coming from? We have some cranial nerves. So the first one is your ocular motor nerves. Ocular motor, that means in the eye, so that's going to cause your pupils to constrict. You have some facial nerves that would activate your nasal glands, right? So you're smelling because you're trying to think about food, like you're thinking about eating. Glossopharyngeal nerves, that's your salivary glands, it's activating those. And then you have your vagus nerve that slows the heart. Your vagus nerve controls all your internal organs. That's a very important one to remember. If I quiz you, I'm really going to quiz you on the vagus nerve. Slows the heart, maintains your lungs, bronchi and esophagus, innervates the liver, gallbladder and stomach, and small intestine. So in other words, these are all activated. Kidneys and your pancreas. So all of your, pretty much everything is slowed except for anything that has to do with digesting food. Rest and digest. Spinal nerves, S2 through S4. Okay, so that's your sacrum. That's at the very bottom, right? That's right at the curve of your back. So the neuron would arise from the gray matter. We just talked about that, and you labeled a diagram of spinal in the sacral region. They run from the ventral root to the other half of the intestines, urinary bladder, ureters, and reproductive organs. This is where reproduction would also occur. Like for females, you would be releasing eggs. For males, you'd be producing sperm. So pretty much these S2 through S4 would control all the lower intestinal, urinary, and reproductive organs. Okay, so that's your preganglion. So imagine that coming from those structures, and now in the ganglion. So those are coming from your cranial nerves, and then of course you have your S2 through S4. So when you get to the ganglion, this is where you're going to use acetylcholine. For parasympathetic, the only neurotransmitter that you have is acetylcholine, ACH, and that is what will be transferred. The post-ganglionic neuron, so that comes from the synapse, so the ganglion, all the way to the organ. It would start in the ganglion and go to whatever effector organ, so your eyes, your nasal glands, salivary glands, heart, respiratory system, digestive organs, urinary, or reproductive. So here's some pictures to kind of show you. So this would be your preganglionic neuron. It would go from the cranial nerve to the synapse, which is your ganglion. Remember, all of these are transferring acetylcholine. And from there, the post-ganglionic neuron will go all the way to the effector organ. And then the ACH would would cross the synaptic cleft into whatever effector organ it was, either eye, salivary glands, your heart, your lungs, your bronchi, your liver, stomach, intestines, kidneys, ureter, reproductive organs. So you can see the S2 through S4. Okay, so just so you can see them all, so you have your cranial nerves, 3 7, 9, and 10. You don't have to have that memorized. The spinal nerves S2 through 4, that goes to the ganglion where, remember, what's your neurotransmitter? Acetylcholine would be transferred, and then it would go to your post-ganglionic neuron that will go to your major organ. It would inhibit most organs, but it would excite your intestines or anything having to do with digestion or urinary or even reproduction. Okay, so now we're going to talk about sympathetic. So during your sympathetic is this high stress emergency. So this is fight or flight. This is put in place by your body to help you survive in a predator-prey situation, mostly. So it is triggered by emergency or threatening situations, although we, as humans, we will make it ourselves by exercising. So exercising is a way that you can produce the norepinephrine and get the same kind of effects. So just like I said, during any vigorous physical activity, exercise, excitement, or when you're embarrassed. When you're nervous is another example. Anything that would cause your heart to increase, that is putting you into the sympathetic system. Your signs. So how do you know, hey, I'm in the sympathetic system? Your heart rate is increasing. Your mouth is dry, your sweaty skin, your pupils are dilated, your lungs are dilated because you're increasing ventilation. So you're breathing more heavily. So those of you that get nervous during tests, what you're doing is you're taking all that energy and all the nerve impulses and you're putting them towards not your brain, but towards these different organs. It's going to stop things like digestion. The liver will release more glucose to accommodate the increase in energy that's needed for the body cells. That's why when you exercise more, you're releasing more glucose and you're burning more fat. You have a shorter preganglionic neuron and a lot longer post-ganglionic neuron. Okay, so preganglionic neuron, anatomically more complex because it innervates more organs. So in other words, it's controlling a lot more things than with sympathetic because a lot of things are being turned on. All arise from the spinal cord segments of the T1 through L2, so the thoracic to the lumbar. T1 through T6, that would activate your eyes, skin, salivary glands, heart, aorta, lungs, and esophagus. T5 through L2, those are coming from, but they will eventually get to your stomach, intestines, liver, spleen, and kidneys. And T10 through L2 is your lower aorta, your urinary bladder, and reproductive organs. So remember, your preganglionic neuron is starting at these places from T1 all the way to L2. So there aren't any cranial nerves here. So it's a little bit more complex. So it comes from your spinal cord here, right? So the ventral root, and it kind of does a weird, it's like almost like a highway, like it loops around in the ganglion. Okay, so T1 through L2, this is the only location. There are no cranial nerves when you're talking about sympathetic. And then this would be like your preganglionic neurons. Preganglion, and this would be the ganglion. Okay, so there's two neurotransmitters. You have acetylcholine and norepinephrine. When you guys were labeling, you saw that there was the dorsal root ganglion. The reason why is because of things like this. Okay, so you can see from T1 to L2 how it spreads out and controls the same organ systems, but it's just going to do the opposite. So for instance, before when you were slowing down your heart rate, now it's going to increase and stimulate your lungs, stimulate your heart, but now opposite, it's going to slow down your liver, slow down your stomach. If you're trying to get away from a prey, you don't want to be digesting food. You want all that energy to go into your cardiovascular system in order to get away, and also some of your muscles. Okay, so your postganglionic neuron, the dendrites are in the ganglion and the axon terminal are attached to the effectors. You also have your adrenal medulla, that's your adrenaline, right? It stimulates those cells, and what will happen is it will secrete more epinephrine and norepinephrine into the blood, producing that surge of adrenaline. So when you exercise and you feel amazing because you have all that norepinephrine and that adrenaline, that runner's high, that's what you're getting out of that. Okay, I think that's it for now. We will be doing an activity on Thursday, but we'll talk more about that later. Okay, thank you.